Hi everyone, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 25th of September. So at this point, we would have seen the battle over Citizen Kane. So we had a little bit of historical background. We saw the film Citizen Kane, and we saw Roger Ebert talk about how Citizen Kane is so important from a cinematic perspective. Now, one of the things that I wanted us to transition into was talking a little bit about literature, and I would argue that Citizen Kane is indeed a kind of literature. It's just visual literature rather than written literature. So today I wanted to talk about A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, two stories that both have the name sorrow within them, but they're different in the sense that one is considered to be canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of literary study, and one isn't. So I wanted to talk about evaluation in terms of quality. I also wanted to talk a little bit about different ways that you could go about writing about fiction. And this applies both to literature as well as to cinema. And as you know, paper number one is due on the 19th. And I encourage early papers. It's a rolling deadline, so I'm hoping that you get in that paper sooner rather than later. It's a critical paper, so you shouldn't be consulting outside sources. It's approximately 4 to 5 pages long, but as longer as it should be. And you are being asked to write about a short story from the fiction section, or also you can refer to Citizen Kane. So those are your options in terms of the possibilities for the paper. I had reviewed some of the possible paper topics that you could pursue, which were examining things like canon or examining things like contemporary relevance. Those are questions that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers. I'm more interested in your reasoning. That said, you don't have to pursue one of those options. You can create your own essay topic, but you do need to have the topic approved by me, and it does have to be on one of the texts that we are either viewing or watching in, or that we are viewing or reading in the fiction section. So, as you know, Roger Ebert gave a detailed analysis about Citizen Kane, and I can share with you that there is much more to examine in terms of that film. So, it would take hours and hours and hours. This just gives you a little bit of a taste of how one could go about analyzing film from an analytic perspective. And I believe, as I shared with you when I first watched Citizen Kane, I really didn't understand what I was seeing when I was an undergraduate student. So while you may not necessarily be a fan of Citizen Kane, I hope that now, after learning a little bit about its background, watching the film, and watching Roger Ebert, who perhaps is the most well-known film critic in cinema, that while you may not like Citizen Kane, at least you understand its importance and its brilliance. In many ways, it revolutionized film. That said, we've been talking a little bit about different ways that one could go about analyzing film and thinking about things like cinematography, the score, the special effects, the lighting, the acting, the directing, the writing, the editing, the pacing, the set design, the sound, the makeup, the costuming. And yes, Citizen Kane, you can check off all those categories, but I wanted you to see a brief little clip of, in my opinion, what is the perfect scene that encompasses all of those elements. And no, it's not something from the 1940s. It's actually something that's rather contemporary. So if you see in the notes below, and I always include the notes below the video, the perfect scene, for my opinion, is very brief. It's just a few minutes long. It comes from a television show, so it doesn't necessarily have to be from cinema, but I would argue that the scene is quite cinematic. It might be a television show that you are familiar with, Stranger Things, and while you can appreciate the scene if you don't have the context and don't know the series, you can truly appreciate the details of the scene if you understand the story. But in my mind, it's got everything. I know the first time that I watched this, I streamed it on Netflix, and immediately after seeing it, I was certain that it was something that I wanted to show in my class as an example of, from my opinion, the perfect scene. And of course, there's some subjectivity involved with this, just like there's some subjectivity involved with canon. But there still should also be some criteria in terms of evaluating quality. So, one of the things we talk about in terms of literature, that it's something that we can reread and it can generate new meaning. It has a depth and a complexity to it. It has a uniqueness to it, so it's not predictable. It's normally not written just for profit or entertainment, though it could be written for profit and entertainment. Shakespeare's a great example, who wrote to entertain the masses. It was the TV of the day. And yes, he generated profit. However, it also had a level of creativity that to this day inspire scholars and critics to come up with new interpretations. I would argue that we see the same thing with something like Citizen Kane. And if you look in the notes below in the third section, we talk about pieces of literature and also film that don't have that element of canon to them as being formulaic, that they usually aren't considered worthy of study because they're written primarily for profit and for entertainment. They're usually formulaic, they're usually predictable, they're usually very trite. Oftentimes it's genre literature, so westerns follow certain criteria, romances follow certain criteria, horror follows certain criteria. Now, as you know, I'm a horror fan, so that's not to say that all genre literature doesn't have levels of creativity to it or can't be studied from an academic perspective. I do that in Gothic literature, for instance, where we study texts such as Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But I would argue that even though they follow a formula, they still are doing things that are creative in terms of plot or characters or settings. And the writing and the length as well is very open-ended. And to illustrate this point, the textbook, that is, gives you an example from a chapter, actually, of a novel, romance novel called The Secret Sorrow. And I was able to find the link for that chapter so that you could access that in the notes below if you wanted to. And I can tell you that one of the reasons why this is considered formulaic is that it is very predictable and trite. The story, you should already get a sense that there is a problem when you can summarize an entire novel and its preceding 10 chapters in just a few sentences. Basically, there's a couple, Faye and Kai, and they are experiencing difficulties as we read chapter 11 and we see very trite and cliche and melodramatic language, which is a bad sign. We see that the difficulty is that Faye is not able to conceive, so she wants to end their relationship, thinking that that would be fairest to Kai. What I can summarize this very quickly for you. She says, I can't have kids. He says, so? She says, it's not fair to you. He says, it's okay. She says, we have to break up. He says, we'll adopt. She says, really? He says, okay. And they live happily ever after. And the point of this is not that the problem isn't complex. The problem could be quite complex. The resolution occurs in just a few sentences, which is not very indicative of the complexity of literature nor the complexity of real life. And literature, and also great cinema, reflects the complexity of life. I believe I've mentioned Oppenheimer before. If you haven't had a chance yet to see it, really do see it, because it is a great piece of literature, because it has that complexity associated with it. Yes, it was meant to entertain. Yes, it was meant to generate profit, but there is so much more. So, literature can be exemplified by something like A Sorrowful Woman, which is on page 39 if you're using the edition of the text that I had ordered, or you can see that I was able to find a link for it. But just to give you an idea about how confined formulaic writing is, there are strict rules for plot. There are strict rules for characters. There are strict rules for setting. There are strict rules for love scene. There are even strict rules for writing and for length that you have to follow. And if you don't follow those, then you're not following the criteria. So I always think of this whenever a student asks, how long should my paper be? And I say, well, it should be as long as it needs to be. And I don't mean to be facetious, and I don't mean to be flip, but the idea is that how could you tell a painter, for instance, how long their painting should be? Or how would you tell, let's say, an author how many words they should be? And they give you this formula tip sheet, again, for romances, but it could have been for horror, it could have been for westerns, it could have been for anything, really. And you can see that we're told specifically, or the author is told specifically, how they should write their particular text. Right down to the number of words that they use in that text, that they should avoid complex sentences and complex themes. And again, this is outlandish. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. Certainly you can see it on your own when they talk about it. But that romance tip sheet, which is included, at least in the version of the text that I have ordered, starting around, I don't know, page 26 or so. You can see that the plot should be on the growing relationship between the heroine and the hero, their misperceptions, but of course the happy ending. We can't have a sad ending. If we got a sad ending, we wouldn't be getting our money's worth, because this is what we're expecting. It's much like comfort food. It's supposed to reassure. The heroine should be between the ages of 19 and 28. That's usually what society considers the epitome of perfection. And of course, there's supposed to be some escapism in this when a reader is reading this, and probably the reader is female. Not that the reader has to be female, but it should be told from her point of view because most readers are females. And while she can be involved in a number of professions, such as doctor or lawyer, her job cannot basically overshadow or dominate her life, because the primary focus is on love and love relationships. The hero can be about 10 years older, and he needn't be handsome in a traditional sense, but he must be strongly masculine, and he looks wonderful in a three-piece suit or in sports clothes. Basically, the ideal mate. And while his past, it might be shrouded with some mystery, ultimately, this is not his fault. Whatever mystery has resulted in his sadness. Secondary characters are just that. They're like window dressing the other woman, the other man. Settings are usually contemporary and romantic. However, at the ending, they might end with a small suburban town for a happily ever after. Love scenes need to be seen through a soft romantic lens. No coarse language, no vivid imagery. That's another genre. That's porn. And there are expectations for that as well. But again, as I said, what makes my heart sad is the section on writing. Avoid complex sentences, long paragraphs, lengthy descriptions. Use concise, vivid details. Be sure to allow the reader to experience the romantic mood. Dialogue should sound like ordinary conversation. Overall writing should be contemporary English without slang, difficult foreign expressions, strange dialects, racial epithets, or obscenities, though a few mild swears like hell and damn are okay. And the length should be about 55,000 to 65,000 words in 10 to 12 chapters. Again, this is not to disparage reading a romance novel, which serves its purpose for escapism and entertainment. But I think you will see, just like you saw with Citizen Kane, was doing more than just providing escapism and entertainment. There was a level of depth and complexity there that we're also going to be seeing in the pieces of literature that follow, including A Sorrowful Woman. And the difference between A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman is probably immediately obvious when you try to read the two side by side. A Secret Sorrow is a very easy read. You don't need to reread it. Once you have read it once and understood the plot, there really is nothing to reread about. And A Sorrowful Woman is quite different. It raises questions immediately. It requires you to think. It requires multiple rereadings. In fact, the plot oftentimes is not as clear as it appears to be. In A Sorrowful Woman, for instance, in the plot, we have a woman who's sorrowful. There doesn't seem to be a very clear reason why. It seems like she's got a good husband, and it seems like she's got a beautiful child, yet she still feels unfulfilled. And the time of the story is going to be central. It was in the early 70s. So think about some of the restrictions for female in the 1970s. Think about the importance of the women's rights movement in the 1970s. Written by Gail Godwin, a female author who would oftentimes write about feminist themes, which is exactly what we see in A Sorrowful Woman, though there are many other themes that are embedded in there. The wife continues to isolate herself. The husband continues to maintain that he understands these things. And what he does is he tries to alleviate the workload and the responsibility for the sorrowful woman, or a sorrowful woman, I should say. That's important. Rather than talking about her feelings and the difficulties that she's experiencing. Not that we can blame him, because ultimately, again, he's as much a product of his time. And you just didn't talk about things like mental illness or depression during this time period. And while it's easy to put a label on the woman and say she's depressed, that's not really the interesting question. The interesting question is, why is she depressed? Which gets us back to the idea of the time period and some of the lack of freedoms that she feels because of the time period. In fact, as the short story continues, we can see that the husband, and note that none of these characters are named, which is important, gives them a certain sense of anonymity. It also removes their individuality. It allows us to plug ourselves, perhaps, into their situation. That ultimately the husband gets a girl, and he makes sure to find a girl who's energetic and competent, but not pretty. He doesn't want this girl to be a sexual threat to the woman. And the result is that the woman does feel threatened because the girl is able to accomplish the task the woman cannot. Ultimately, the girl is fired. The woman increasingly isolates herself to the point where she is in a separate bedroom, accepting notes from her family. Eventually, she emerges. It's springtime. Spring is oftentimes used as a symbol of hope or rebirth or renewal. Note that the story takes place first in the winter, which sets the tone for darkness and despair. And then at the very ending of the story, what we have is the woman engaged in a flurry of activity. And then the husband comes to find the woman in bed. And what has happened, and we're not directly told this is related to plot, is that the woman has committed suicide. There are clues to show that she's committed suicide, but I would not at all be surprised if some of you are listening to this right now and saying, I read the story and I didn't realize that she committed suicide, which illustrates how much more complex this story is than A Secret Sorrow. So a good piece of literature, just like a good piece of cinema, requires multiple viewings or rereadings. I suggest 3. The first for plot, the second for analysis, the third to remind yourself before you start talking about it. And the hints or the clues is that one of the things that the husband tries to do to help the woman, and we can't really assume any ill intent here. We don't get his story, though that would be a fascinating short story, A Sorrowful Man. But basically, he's making her a sleeping draft, a sleeping liquid. And at one point, he's making weekly batches. And basically, she keeps that in a cupboard. And there's one line in the story that's quite telling, that she goes to the cupboard and she takes what was hers. So basically, she's taking the sleeping draft and she overdoses on it. And then at the very ending, we aren't told she committed suicide. That would be too formulaic. That would be something that we would expect from formula fiction. Instead, we're told about the actions of the father, and we need to interpret what those actions mean. And this is the very last paragraph. And again, I've included the link to the short story because I was able to find it online. But, of course, it's included on page 39 of your textbook. The boy says, look, Mommy is sleeping. She's tired from doing all our things again. He dawdled in a stream of the last sun for that day and watched his father roll tenderly back her eyelids. The father's rolling back her her eyelids because he's looking at pupil dilation. His ear softly to her breast. So basically, the father's listening for a heartbeat. The delicate bones of her wrist. The father's checking for a pulse. The father put down his face into her freshly washed hair. And the idea is that he's mourning at this point. Can we eat the turkey for supper? The boy asked. So, of course, the boy is oblivious to what's happened, but one would expect that of a 3-year-old. And if you'll see in the notes below, I've given you some things to consider right at the very beginning before you start reading. Look at the author. Who wrote this thing? How might that give you a clue? Look at the dates, much like I had talked about. Look at the title, A Sorrowful Woman. Of course, the question is, why is this person sorrowful? A suggests one of many, as opposed to the sorrowful woman, which could be one. I would suggest that this is just the story, not just of one person, but perhaps many people. One of the reasons why we aren't given names. These characters are known by their roles rather than as individuals. And then, of course, the plot. So if you were surprised by the fact that she committed suicide, the first thing you need to do is to go back and reread the story carefully to make sure that you understand plot. Plot is the least of it, but without understanding plot, you can't understand things like the character and the setting, the use of language, the themes, the important quotes. Note that if we are addressing a text in our textbook, there are oftentimes questions at the ending of the text to help guide our reading. That can be very useful. In fact, I have students oftentimes say that they will read those questions first in order to give them a sense as to how to go about reading. And of course, your questions. As we will see with complex pieces of literature, that the questions are sometimes more important than the answers and don't necessarily have clear-cut answers. Now, I had included in the notes below some of the notes that I'm going to be discussing next class about a sorrowful woman. And I've already started some of these, talking about no names, for instance, or looking at color imagery. You may or may not have noticed that the child's eyes and the husband's shirt were gray. This sets the tone or the mood for darkness and despair. There are episodes that have symbolic meaning, such as, for instance, wearing a bra that the husband removes from the woman, that I wanted to talk about next class in more depth. And that said, I wanted to talk also a little bit about how to write about fiction, which was another reading that I had scheduled for today. And of course, since we're talking about topics for papers, and I encourage you to submit in a paper earlier rather than later, I wanted to draw your attention to those questions about fiction that you can also ask yourself about cinema as well. This is on pages 46 to 65 of the textbook. Unfortunately, I was not able to find these available online. But of course, as you know, a version of the textbook is on reserve in the GCC library. And I certainly don't want you to go through all of these questions, much like a checklist, and try to answer them all. These are things for you to put in the back of your mind when you are watching a film, much like Robert Ebert would have addressed some of these questions when he was talking about Citizen Kane. Or when you're reading a piece of literature. So thinking about the plot, is it formulaic? Is it predictable? What is the conflict? There has to be some sort of conflict, or else you don't have a story. Is the story told chronologically? And if not, it's probably important, as we saw with Citizen Kane. What does the exposition reveal? In other words, how is information about background characters revealed? Is the conflict resolved at the end? And just like in real life, sometimes it's not. Who is the protagonist, the hero, the main character? Who's the antagonist? Is it clear? Do they change roles over the course? Could the antagonist be not a person, but a thing, something like the weather, for instance? Are the characters, do they have depth and complexity, or are they rather stereotypical? How does the author reveal these characters? What's the purpose of the minor characters? Is the setting important? Is it used symbolically, representationally? So it's supposed to suggest something else. And as I was suggesting with the weather, could the setting be an antagonist? Who's telling the story? And how would it change if somebody else was telling the story? That's the brilliance of Citizen Kane, is that we get so many perspectives. Is the narrator reliable and objective? And again, we're getting pieces from different people in Citizen Kane. How much can we trust their perceptions? Does the author ever directly comment on the action? And if it were told from a different point of view, how would that influence not only your viewing of cinema, but reading of literature, now that we're starting to actually read pieces of literature? Are there any objects that are used in the story as representational? In other words, symbolic? What are the themes or the major truths that are included in that piece? Is it directly stated? And I can just about guarantee you, no, it's not. You're not going to be directly told in Citizen Kane what rosebud means. You're going to have to try to figure it out. As Roger Ebert says, it means everything and nothing. You don't have to agree with the author's perspective, but you need to be able to identify the author's perspective. Does the author's perspective confirm your values, or does it challenge it? Is the style consistent? What kind of language is used? The diction? How does that contribute to the tone of the piece? And again, my favorite definition for literature or for canon, that which is worth academic study. Is it worth viewing or reading more than once? And each time you do so, do you get new depth and new complexity? And is there a particular critical response that can help you understand the piece? So knowing biographical information about the author, much like I shared just a very little bit about the author from A Sorrowful Woman. Gail Godwin is a PhD in English and was known as a feminist writer. So this is a bit of a lens as to how to view that particular piece. And certainly we talked a little bit about who Orson Welles was, and of course William Randolph Hearst, to try to understand a little bit of Citizen Kane. But of course this is also limiting because biography does not translate completely over into fiction. So fiction is about creativity. Or how about historical information about the piece? So not only did we talk about the history of William Randolph Hearst with Citizen Kane, but I suggested that the history of the late 60s and early 70s and the women's rights movement would be very important for you to understand A Sorrowful Woman. What kinds of evidence or details are you focusing on? As we saw Roger Ebert do so well, we would pick on a detail and talk about the significance of that. And there were many other details he could have talked about, so he could have gone on for hours and hours. To what extent do your own experiences, values, beliefs, and assumptions inform your interpretation? And there are lots of ways that you can interpret something. Which one seems to be the most useful for you? As I had indicated, don't fall in love with a particular kind of interpretation. Say you're a psychological critic and that you want to examine everything from a psychological perspective. Let the text decide for you what is the best lens to examine a piece of literature. So, thinking about things like even important quotes, the quotes you select will help you formulate your argument, as we will talk about next class. But what I wanted to do is to have you think a little bit more about A Sorrowful Woman. And while certainly reading all of the material is important, especially reading the pieces of fiction. Now that we've basically watched our major film in the film section, Citizen Kane, and I'm assuming that you have watched it, the following pieces in the fiction section are going to be short story, just because we simply don't have time for a novel. But while it's important to read everything, it's particularly important to read those short stories. And the good news is that I've been able to find links for those online, which I will provide to you. But of course, you can find this in your textbook as well. So in terms of what I had assigned for today, and I guess, the definition of short story is that it's a story that's short, but that's very unsatisfying. There is such a thing called a novella, something that's longer than a short story, but not quite as long as a novel. Basically, a short story usually talks about one incident. We'll talk about subplots, a main plot and other plots, usually when we get into things that are longer, such as novels or perhaps drama. Drama will be our second unit this semester. But in addition to writing about fiction and the list of questions for you to think about, on page 50 is a sample paper in progress. And we'll be talking about writing a paper over the course of the semester. And I'm assuming that you had also talked about this in your English 101 class or your introductory English class. That's a prerequisite for this class. But basically, the idea of journaling, writing informal responses, this is very similar to annotating, which is taking notes. But in annotating, you might do it in the actual book itself or on the screen itself, as opposed to journaling, where you might do it on a separate screen or you might do it on a separate sheet of paper. And the beauty of it is that you get to write down your responses without having to worry about grammar or mechanics or even content. This is just a way for you to begin to brainstorm ideas. And brainstorming is the step that most students skip when they're writing a paper. They try to go directly to writing the perfect first sentence. And it's a very poor way to write because ultimately you're wasting a lot of time that way. Rather than rewriting a sentence over and over again so that it sounds perfect, you're much better off trying to generate ideas. And I personally do that in list form just because I like lists, but you can do it in lots of different ways. And what's great about it, again, is that you don't have to worry about grammar. You don't have to worry about mechanics. You don't have to worry about even content. You aren't showing this to anybody. This is for your eyes only. Then you can begin the drafting stage where you begin to organize these ideas into sentences and paragraphs. And then you've got the editing where you polish it so that ultimately you can submit it. So if you are thinking about whether or not Citizen Kane should be considered part of the literary canon, well, then you're thinking about, does it reach that level of quality that we've been talking about? Is it something that can be seen more than once and it has new meaning? And of course, you'd have to use references from the film in order to be able to support that. Usually we talk about page numbers if we're using a direct quote. Timestamps are what we usually use when we're talking about film. Is it something that has creativity and depth and sophistication? Is it something that's unique? Does it have some message or messages? Is it using language and setting in unique ways? Are the characters unique? My job is basically to take the opposite position of whatever you say. So if you say that, yes, Citizen Kane should be part of the canon, I'll say, no, it shouldn't. And I'll come up with all kinds of reasons why, because it's old and it is perhaps something that is not relevant. So, and you can come up with that. Your argument could be that Citizen Kane should not be part of the canon. And then you give the reasons why, but you have to justify those reasons with evidence from the text. And of course, if you're saying Citizen Kane should not be part of the canon, I'm saying, oh, yes, it should. And it's the same with whether or not the piece still has contemporary relevance. If you say, yes, it does, I'll say, no, it doesn't. So you have to make references from the text to show that it does, or vice versa. And if you decide not to write about Citizen Kane, you decide to write about some of the short stories, then you'd have to do the same thing. So should A Sorrowful Woman be considered part of the canon? And you'll have to give reasons and evidence to justify that. Or do you think A Sorrowful Woman has contemporary relevance? And you'll have to give reasons and evidence for that. But those are merely my suggestion for paper topics. As you know, you can come up with your own paper topic, but you do need to have the paper topic approved by me, and you do need to also make sure that you're talking about one of the texts in the fiction section. That means the film, that being Citizen Kane, or one of the short stories starting with A Sorrowful Woman. So I'm going to leave it here so that we can talk about A Sorrowful Woman in greater depth. And I wanted to talk about A Sorrowful Woman in next class, also talk about The Story of an Hour, and also Rose for Emily. So you can see in the notes below that I have links at least to The Story of an Hour and Rose for Emily. Honor Rose is an interview by the author, and unfortunately that is not available online, but it is in our textbook. But I wanted to briefly talk about it. I suspect I'm going to be falling behind in our reading list at this point. I usually do, but I'll be catching up. My advice to you is that you keep up with the reading list, even though I've fallen somewhat behind, so that ultimately when I do catch up, you'll be at the point where you are caught up as well. But with just the little bit that I've given you about a sorrowful woman, I wanted you to address on our discussion forum. That would be due by Wednesday, the 27th. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers' responses, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. As you can see, I have been responding to all of you. That would give you an idea of what we would have discussed in a class discussion. So if we were in a face-to-face class, my question to you before getting too much into the depth and detail of a sorrowful woman is, why do you think a sorrowful woman begins with an opening statement? That's known as an epigraph, by the way, beginning with an opening line that reads, and notice that there was one line that was separated off from the rest of the story. Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times. And the quote reads again, once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times. And the question is, why do you think the story begins that way? I'm not asking you why does the story begin that way, because I'm curious to hear your responses. And I am also curious to see how your responses are going to be influenced after I talk about the story in greater depth next class. But first, let's start with your responses, and then the next class, I will give some of my own interpretations. So if you wanted a sneak preview, you can look at the notes below and see some of the points that I'm planning on addressing. As well, the questions at the ending of the short story can also give you an idea of some of the things that you might want to pursue or could pursue of thinking about when you are reading it. So ideally, what you would have read for next class is not only A Sorrowful Woman, but The Story of an Hour, which is a very short story. It's just about a page, page and a half, that appeared in an earlier set of readings, but this time I want us to read it from an analytic perspective, as well as reading A Rose for Emily, even though I doubt we'll be able to talk about all of those next class, but I will be catching up. So again, once upon a time, there was a wife and mother. Why too many times? Why do you think A Sorrowful Woman begins with that statement? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about A Sorrowful Woman and The Story of an Hour, if not A Rose for Emily. Take care. Bye-bye.